welcome you this morning to our event, Tackling Future Threats in an Era of Multipolarity. We are living in unprecedented times. Millions of lives and livelihoods already impacted by climate change, disease, scarcity, and devastating conflict. Long-term leadership has never been needed more than as much as it is now, and multilateralism. And we need the right decisions to be taken here in New York and for them to have real impact. Today, we want to talk about the policies that are needed, tangible actions we can take, and the kind of partnerships, policies, and financial instruments that can meet this difficult moment. The watchword for the moment is uncertainty, and we all need help navigating those times. Our guests today and our panels have very deep experience of running ministries, philanthropies, countries, and driving change at home and internationally. One, two. I have a request. Can we reduce the light at the back? I think it's from the projection. So I will ask the sound and light people to see what they can do about that.
My eyes cannot tolerate it.
Okay. We might have to take the slide down. There we are. Magic. I hope everybody got a picture with this slide. So it gives me great pleasure, therefore, and it's a great honour to introduce and moderate our first distinguished panel. We have Their Excellencies, President Santos, former President of Colombia, Nobel Peace Laureate, Chair of the Elders, a Peace Laureate for complex peace negotiations which ended years of intractable armed conflict. We have Her Excellency Mary Robinson, former President of the Republic of Ireland, member of the Elders and honorary co-president of the Africa-Europe Foundation, former UN High Commissioner of Human Rights, passionate advocate for gender, women's participation in peace building and climate justice. Zaid Ra'ad Al Hussein, member of the Elders, former UN High Commissioner of Human Rights, champion of international justice and multilateralism, and an advocate for peace and a peacekeeping expert. Helen Clark, former Prime Minister of New Zealand, co-chair of the Independent Panel, member of the Elders, an unyielding champion of girls and women, and an advocate for multilateralism and nuclear disarmament. And Dr. Gro Harlem Brundtland, first woman Prime Minister of Norway, former DG of the WHO, member of the Elders, and someone who puts sustainable development right at the heart of the international agenda. Wow, can you just give our amazing panel a huge hand? What an honor. So we will dive right in. President Santos, if I can start with you. Your experience as a national and international leader has seen you active across international architecture. When you look at the emerging world order and disorder, what opportunities, if any, do you see to restore common purpose, peace, and action against current and emerging threats?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for having us again here in a, I would say, difficult or interesting time, full of challenges. How can we confront and face these challenges? What's the best way to go about solving the problems that we have right now? Well, I like to compare what is happening in the world with what is happening in many of our countries. Democracies are on the defensive, but democracies and the world order depends on institutions. And institutions depend on the people who are part of those institutions, or the international institutions are dependent on what the member states want them to be. So we have to address the leadership. And I think that's where the problem is, but that's where also the solution is. You mentioned something that we in the Elders insist on long-term leadership, long-term view, leaders that don't depend on the results of what they do in the short term, but see the long term and take decisions that many times are unpopular or difficult. And that is what we are lacking. And we need to try to promote that new type of leadership, which we had sometimes in the past, but for many reasons, among them the technological revolution, social media, which makes every decision almost an immediate reaction. We need those leaders that see the long term and take decisions for the benefit of the long term. I think there's an opportunity right now. People are asking everywhere, what's going to happen? Where are we going? And also that type of environment generates opportunities to fill the vacuum with ideas that are convincing and ideas that will have the support of enough people and enough institutions to make the reforms that are necessary. Just look at what is happening with the UN. The UN, I think, has never met in more difficult times since its creation after the Second World War. Everybody's saying the UN is not working. Everybody's saying the UN should be, some of them abolished, which I think is absurd, but reformed, which I think is the adequate way to go about it. But how do you reform the UN? Well, it depends on the member states. And the member states depends on the leaders of each member state. So that's where we have to concentrate our efforts, generate enough consensus to promote necessary reforms, and that's the way you recover democracies from autocracies, the way you recover the world order from this present world disorder.
Thank you, President Santos. If I can bounce off that and go to Mary, your leadership on climate is legendary, and many other issues besides. And when you consider today's interlocking crises, what advice do you have for leaders on how they can maintain ambition on climate change, on human rights, on health, in this fractured landscape? How can we get leaders to take that longer view? And are there examples that give you hope?
Well, first of all, I echo what Juan Manuel said. It's great to be here, all five of us together. It's the only time in this whole week that we're together, all five of us, so it's nice that we have this. And, I don't think we want to maintain the level of ambition on climate and on pandemics and on nuclear weapons. We want to raise the ambition because we are in a crisis. And I think Juan Manuel has identified the ingredients of that crisis very well. We're in a crisis in our world. We need leaders to be in crisis mode. And we need leaders to be in crisis mode about the science which is guiding us. It's guiding us on health. Some people are saying extraordinary things, but the science is clear. It's vital on climate. And somehow leaders are ignoring the science too much, are not actually grounding their way forward on science. I have to say, as somebody who's been at COPs and seen the way it's going, I was actually very aware that until quite recently, the link, the nexus, the strong nexus between climate and health wasn't figured there. It now is, which has totally enriched the discussion, totally. It's so important because when you link climate and health, you're talking about people. And to a very large extent, when you're talking about climate, it can become very impersonal, very scientific and kind of remote and technical, and people don't understand. But when you talk about climate and health, when you talk about people's lives, when you talk about heat and the impact of heat on people, then it's real. And I'm very glad that the WHO has come out with this draft action plan on climate and health. That's really important. In a way, as elders, we're very aware of that clumsy word that is so part of the women's movement, intersectionality. There is that intersectionality between all these crises. And I want to make a plug, because Juan Manuel is too modest to do it. The elders are going to launch a paper tomorrow, a policy paper on multilateralism, which addresses the fragmentation and tries to say, yes, despite all this, we can and must move forward. And the long view leadership is very much part of that. But we show it is possible, and we see it. We see it in the earlier this year on pandemics, the pandemic treaty. Just before we came here to this meeting, the High Seas Treaty. Things are moving. Those who want to move are moving. Those who want to move on Gaza, on the two-state solution, were trying to do it yesterday. It is so important to keep moving with whatever coalitions of the willing we can have. And I think our policy paper is grounded in a very tough reality of now, but the way we move forward on that.
Thank you so much, Mary, and I love that. We don't want to maintain ambition, we want to raise it, and I think that is such an important message for us all. So coming to Zaid, you've got extensive experience in multilateralism and human rights. How can people in this room support the right forces and each other to rebuild trust and take action across systems that have never been under pressure like they are now?
Well, thank you, Eloise. It's wonderful to be back here. There's so many friends in the audience and a lot of troublemakers. I think this is probably the greatest concentration of trouble in New York in one space. Well, so there are a couple of things. I mean, one is that it's amazing how bereft we are of profound ideas. You know, I'm part-time academic, and I spend a lot of time with academics who spend an inordinate amount of time proving small things. I mean, small sort of adjustments to our knowledge. And we don't have what we needed to have, which is an international system where you have a sort of central exchange of profound thinking making its way in and out of the system. You know, if you look at most of the debates in the UN, they're very superficial, they're very general. In the technical bodies, you do have a sort of deep investigation, which is welcomed. But we don't see it sort of peace and security. And sadly, we don't think deeply enough on the human rights domain. And Mary and I think, can talk about this. Of course, you have to work together and coordinate together and support each other. The problem with the human rights movement is that we are essentially cellular, and we believe in the agency of the individual. And for obvious reasons, progressive movements, generally speaking, tend to be weak in any particular moment in time. But if they're pushed hard enough, they then tend to coalesce into something of strength, and that has to happen, of course. But we're still, as you said, we're on the defensive in many parts of the world. I mean, just look at Gaza. It sort of epitomizes, or it's emblematic of where the world is today, the enforced starvation of children. And we just sit there, and we denounce, and we condemn, and what is happening to us, let alone Sudan and Ukraine, and what is happening to us. I mean, it's just phenomenal. And then something has to snap, and we have to sort of, regain a sense of responsibility over this. And Mary and Helen were in that area only a few months ago, and I'll leave it to them to talk about it. But going back to the point, we need the international body to be infused by creative thinking, real creative thinking, not the sort of sham creative thinking, or sort of what pretends to be creative but isn't really creative. And we can get this world back on its feet again.
Thank you. Thank you. Turning to Helen, you've worked across several crucial issues as a leader. When it comes to pandemics and preparedness, what do you think the lessons are that can inform multilateral action in other crises that we've learned in the last few years and continue to learn as we develop the responses coming out of COVID?
Well, just perhaps a step back to some of the points that are being made. We do live in very challenging times, obviously, but I think, you know, sometimes we tend to see our own era as, you know, the most challenging ever. And you think back to what it must have been like to be, you know, caught up in the Great War in Europe, World War I, not knowing whether it would ever end, and then the march of Nazism, fascism in the 30s, you know, sitting in Norway wondering when it's going to reach you, and it's brutal. When does it ever end? It seems to me that we do face very large challenges now. On the other hand, the world is at its wealthiest, it's got its greatest knowledge, it's got connectivity. You know, we do have a lot more tools at our disposal, perhaps, than we went into past crises in. But I think, you know, keep a sense of perspective. You know, in the past, the world has risen to work its way out of challenges, and we could do it again. But leadership is a missing component. You know, think back to perhaps the World War II era. You know, where are today's Churchills, Roosevelts? Weren't too many women on the scene, of course, but there was leadership, and I think we just got that gap in, frankly, the leadership of today. So I think that the critical thing is not to be sort of tackling each of these crises in silos. They're all coming at us at the same time, and hence the emphasis the elders have put on the long view leadership. Take this bigger perspective, look over the horizon, what's coming at us, what are the links between the crises. I probably said it before in this room, but I thought it was quite clever in 2020 when the Partnership for Maternal, Newborn and Child Health, which I chair, coined the phrase of the 3 C's crisis, and it was COVID, climate, and conflicts, and they were all kind of, you know, catapulting off each other and combining to make a bad situation worse. Mary's absolutely right that if we bring the health aspect into the climate debate, we change that debate, because it goes from being something a bit more abstract to something that affects me. You know, if my health's going to be impacted by this, then that's a lot more immediate than what's happening to the polar bear, as it were. So it's really to be welcomed that we bring that health stream into the climate debate. So then come to the pandemic issues. It's not that we haven't made some progress, right? I mean, full marks to diligent negotiators who've just stuck at it in Geneva, got the new international health regulations being implemented really as we speak, got the text of the pandemic agreement. There's still a way to go until we get to ratification, which is awaits the outcome of the pathogen access and benefit sharing talks. And let us really hope the momentum that got to the agreement doesn't get lost now, so that we can tie the whole thing together. So, you know, making the most of opportunities that are available. We have next year the second high-level meeting on pandemic prevention, preparedness and response. Now, if the PABS annex has been completed, that meeting needs to be a rallying cry for ratification, because it could take 2 years for ratifications, and you're losing, you know, time and focus all the time as these things drag on. If the PABS annex isn't negotiated, the high-level meeting must be a rallying cry for getting the job done, because otherwise you fear that it will go on the back burner. The independent panel, which Ellen Johnson-Sirleaf and I still chair and have dedicated panelists, we've just issued, as of today, a briefing document around what we could hope to get from that high-level meeting. And who knows, there may not be another high-level meeting, so make the most of this one. But we think it's critical going into that for the high-level meeting to be affirming that we're talking about global public goods here. You know, everyone has to be on board to keep us all safe from these threats. We have to champion the agreement at the state that it's at and urge more action. We have to look at the financing challenges. We have a pandemic fund, there's various other sorts of funds, but the finance isn't enough. But then we say this in the context of what's happening with global health and development financing generally. So are there new ways that we can mobilize financing? Is global public investment an idea whose time has come? There's still all these issues of equity and fairness and access and regional self-reliance, health sovereignty. These need an airing at the high-level meeting. We still don't really have a clear idea going forward of what will be the mechanisms for risk-informed readiness, because if you don't know your risks, what are you preparing for in pandemic threats? We went into the last pandemic thinking it was like the flu. It wasn't. We'll go into the next one thinking it's like COVID. It may not be. So being better risk-informed is something that needs a lot more attention. So just really to round off, I think a problem with pandemic threats has been that you go through the epicenter of the crisis and then people want to put it behind them and go on to the next thing. Well, if you do that, you're doomed to repeat the lessons of history. So we have to keep a focus on this and recognize that it's one of a set of existential threats that's coming at humanity. And we do have the tools and the mechanisms to plot a better way through it, but we can't relax our view and focus on it. And hence the call for leadership, sustained leadership across these big long view issues, which sees that the mechanisms, the processes, the financing, the law, the regulations are put in place so that we can cope better next time. Thanks.
Thank you. And great to hear again about some things that are working, progress on the pandemic agreement, also the promise that global public investment holds, and other issues. So if I can go to Dr. Brundtland. Dr. Brundtland, in your role, both as DG of WHO and in your prime ministerial role, you've been considered as someone who really brought sustainable development into the world. What do you think partners, donors, and financing stakeholders should do, and how they should think about and action sustainable development and gender equity in today's world? And how do we keep that sort of flag flying when we have so many existential crises around us?
Well, let me reflect on some of what all my fellow elders have been saying. Mary pointing at the importance of climate and health being seen together. And it is one example of many about the connectivity of all of the issues that we are facing. And without realizing that connectivity and the interdependence between nations, it is really impossible to build and to continue having strong international institutions. Now, going back to when I was, well, first environment minister, then prime minister, acid rain was an issue. Where did it come from? It came from Great Britain, across the North Sea, and then spreading over Europe, and a lot of it into the Scandinavian area. And to realize the importance of this, it was essential, and I'm glad I was a medical doctor, even a public health expert, when I was first environment minister, then prime minister, because it helped me understand the importance exactly of human health, when the environment and nature is threatened. Because it seems easier for people to think that nature and environment are, well, that's a long-term threat. It's not going to affect us. But of course, it was already affecting human beings breathing air that was dangerous. So it just illustrates that we have been on a long road from the 60s and 70s until today. And sustainable development was the conclusion of our Common Future Commission that I led in the 70s. No, the 80s, I mean, the 80s, from 83 to 87. And it led to the Rio conference 5 years later. And important decisions were made by the international community in those years. Agenda 21, the Climate Convention, decertification. It was really impressive how much breakthrough happened in the end of the 80s and into the 90s. Now, I'm moving from that picture because, as Helen said, yes, there have been dramatic situations internationally, globally, when you look at our lifetime. And I was a child and a refugee to Sweden, you know, when I was a little child, because of the Nazi occupation and everything that really destroyed Europe and led to the United Nations being established. Now, but I want to jump from this perspective now to what Helen was saying about the pandemics. Because you asked me about one part of my life, which is being Director General of the WHO. And, well, we had SARS at that time. And if I hadn't been Prime Minister before and understood that there is no other authority in the world than the WHO, when something that spreads across borders by airplanes are happening. There is no, we don't have a leader of the world, we don't have a prime minister or a president governing the world when we have common threats. So I realized, given the constitution of the WHO, I knew that we were supposed to, according to that constitution, to deal with issues that threatened public health across the world. Which is why we made recommendations about not flying people from this country to, as the outbreaks came in different countries, we stopped the airline industry. And you can imagine what my people in WHO said. Oh, we can't do that. We cannot say these things. The airline industry will be completely crazy. I said, well, we will all be crazy if we're not doing anything, because no prime minister across the world has the authority to deal with something that is global. Now, and here we are, pandemics. That was, I mean, the international health regulations were formulated during my time, and I'm glad that the pandemic treaty has been somehow resolved, but it is only halfway, because we have a situation that where leadership is less prevalent than maybe ever before. And this has to do with all the different challenges, and it is easier for each country to think mostly about itself and not about our interdependence, our interconnectedness. So the idea of long-term, long-view leadership, you know, it requires that the prime ministers and the presidents of governments feel responsibility not only for their own country, but for the world. There is no other leadership in our situation than the sum of what countries are able to do together. Now, just let us use the example of WHO. Who meets in Geneva? The health ministers. They are not able to make decisions that create also the ability and the necessity to push for and decide on financing. Oh, that the finance minister has to decide that, and the prime minister, not the health minister. So we have a very sectored approach. And now is the time to see leadership across all the different areas. And that's why we have to call for the long view leadership. But it means no prime minister, no president should be able to think about his or her own country only. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm just going to ask if any of our esteemed panel want to comment on their colleagues, anything their colleagues have said before we turn to questions. Otherwise, I will ask for questions from the floor. Do we have any volunteers? We have a few minutes for questions. Please. Yeah.
I want to underline what Mary said about being even more ambitious right now. I think this is the attitude that we need. The world, and here in New York, we're living through a moment where people are afraid and people are about to throw in the towel, saying, my God, what is happening? And that is the wrong attitude. I think what is needed is to double down. For example, on the pandemic agreement, something that again is worrisome, and we have to see how that is dealt. The world, people forget very easily their priorities. Climate change and the pandemic was a priority for a long time worldwide. And suddenly the war in Ukraine and the war in Gaza, and so climate change and the pandemics became a second-rate issue. And people did not continue with the momentum that it was needed. And that is one of the reasons why right now, for example, in climate change and the fulfillment of the Paris Agreement, we're way behind. Or the SDGs. The SDGs was a great example of how the world can get together and agree on an agenda. How were the SDGs created, and what was the process? It was a process of marvelous multilateral diplomacy, started by an idea of two young women who then, country by country, started convincing we need to renegotiate the Millennium Goals into something much more ambitious. We need the rich countries to be responsible, and we need the environment to be a fundamental aspect. That at the beginning had a negative reaction. The rich countries did not want to pay, and many people say, well, the environment will complicate things. But slowly, countries were convinced, country by country, of the common benefit of something like having a world agenda. And 10 years ago, it was a marvelous General Assembly. The mood was completely different from what it is now. By unanimity, every single country voted yes. That stories of success, I think we have to reiterate and remember we can do it. And so be more ambitious and focus on the problems that are a priority, and don't be distracted by other issues that emerge from time to time. Otherwise, if your priorities are very much dispersed, then you will not be able to solve any of them. But again, goes back to the leadership issue, which I think all of us have mentioned, because it is a problem of leadership.
Thank you so much. We have time for one or two questions. I now see some hands going up. I spotted chap in the middle first, and then if we go towards the back.
Good morning. I'm Rob Walk. I'm the board chair, U.S. board chair of AMREF Health Africa. I want to say thank you to each of you for all the consequential work and leadership that you're doing. I guess I want to raise the elephant in the room, which is you've all pointed to the huge gap in leadership, in visionary, forward-looking, kind of broad leadership. How do you accomplish all the things that are critical in peacekeeping and climate, in health, in changing the paradigm when some of the largest countries in terms of economic resources, countries like the US, China, Russia, seem to be opting out of leadership on these issues? Can you reach, impactful solutions without that leadership? What strategy would you have in the current environment? Because these are two critical issues not to address, but you have some major obstacles in some of the leading countries in terms of economic and political capacity globally that you haven't had in the past.
Thank you. If you just take one more question towards the back there. Sorry, we're just going to wait for our microphone runner to run. Pass it down. Great.
Thank you for the incredible interventions. My name is Nina. I work with 4PAWS. We were engaged in the pandemic agreement negotiations, and the very first event we had with member states, the first answer that one of the member states told us was, as an animal welfare organization, you're not advocating in the right place. It's not the right box. The WHO is not the right box to tackle the drivers of pandemics, animal welfare, climate. And what I'm hearing is something completely different. You're talking about intersectionality, the need for us to focus on the outcome, the need for us to look at the common benefits. So are we talking about a new way? Are we talking about a multilateral system where international regulations and fora need to work better together? What would the implications be?
Great. So if I can turn to our panel, who would like to take one or both of those questions? Yeah, there's a mic here.
It's an excellent question about leadership. If you spend a long time in the multilateral system, you realize that size of GDP, size of the military, aggressive posture, whatever you want to call it, is really irrelevant. It's the strength of an original idea, which then provides leadership, if it's harnessed and supported. And that idea can come from any quarter. I spoke before the Security Council about 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, and I illustrated this in July of 1958, how the UN was a sieve. There were ideas floating in from all quarters, from ambassadors, from peacekeepers, from heads of states, from Khrushchev and Eisenhower and Macmillan, and it was all being fed in, and no one was excluded from submitting a good idea. And Hammarskjöld just took all of this and worked it into a solution. And that's how the system has to work. Just for all the young people here, there is value in being a strong generalist. Now, all of us have worked in so many different fields. We're deep into the climate field, we're deep into health, we're deep into peace and security and development, and deep into human rights. And we want to see a lot of the young people equally spread across this, not just in one area, but we don't see them in another. Right? And the more you in and out of these, all of them, the more you see things. Why is it that some parts of the international system are so weak and others are really quite strong? Right? It doesn't make any sense. It goes back to Gru's point of how governments are sort of stovepiped, and so we become stovepiped in our thinking, and that can change. So that's part of the response.
Can I just build on what Zaid has been saying with an incredible example, which I love? Law students in Vanuatu decided that there needed to be an advisory opinion of the International Court of Justice. Wow. And then they got the Pacific Islands law students together on it. And then they got Vanuatu as a state to start pushing it. And then we got the resolution of the General Assembly. And we got the whole process, a huge, huge process of the International Court of Justice considering the responsibility of countries in relation to the climate crisis. And the advisory opinion is a wonderful opinion because the court actually worked hard to show just how much states have a responsibility, a legal responsibility, even if they are not part of the climate agreement or opt out of it. They still have that responsibility. And that opinion will strengthen greatly advocacy, but also, I think, will result in a significant number of lawsuits in different richer countries that are not fulfilling their obligations, because it's now very clear how legal it is. It's not just political now, it's legal. Students with their idea and their ambition, things can be triggered in an extraordinary way if you have vision and if you pursue it. And I really thought that was the most brilliant example of young people showing us what they can do when they take leadership. Thank you.
Thank you.
And to answer your question, I'll just give one example. The pandemic agreement. If the US doesn't want to be part, well, so be it. Let's continue. And that's what we're doing. The rest of the world will make an agreement, or we'll put in place an agreement where we'll help each other if the next pandemic or when it comes. But we cannot depend on any one or two countries because the world is much larger. So I think what has happened with the pandemic agreement is what should happen in other issues.
Thank you. Helen and Mary.
I think we should answer the animal health question. Sorry?
Nina's question.
Huh? Yeah, well, no, I was, in connection with what was just said, I mean, withdrawing financing from development, from the WHO, which has happened, from the US, there is no other way for the rest of the world to deal with that than to compensate and to add to the support they are giving to the WHO. We cannot depend on even 3 large nations in a world of 193 countries. So, as you said, we have to deal with it. The ones that are responsible enough to take responsibility.
Helen, please.
Perhaps just going back to the first question, I think one of the positive outcomes of the reflection on the pandemic is that animal health has come much more into the picture alongside the human health issues. And the truth is we'll never be well informed enough about our risks and know what to be prepared for if we don't have that animal health lens on the issue. And also these broader issues of nature and conservation, because we as human beings are increasingly invading the space of wild things, as it were, and we're putting ourselves more at risk. Nature's always been there, but we are intruding on it in a way that makes us, puts us at risk and puts nature at risk as well. So I think this has been positive to bring these strands out, and it's significant that the high-level meetings are high-level meetings on prevention, preparedness and response. So you absolutely need the focus on nature and animal health for that. Just reflecting a little bit on the leadership question that came from AMREF America, as it were. Let's not underestimate the role of regions in leadership. I think the European Union's been very important on climate, for example. Now, of course, it has its slow movers as well, but you know, even when things have been in particularly bleak periods in the US, the EU, among the high-income countries, while you know, tough negotiators, but it has helped push the issues along. I think the role of the African Union and its institutions is incredibly important. And then if we look around to, you know, where there is leadership prepared to speak out in a visionary way, I do look to South Africa and President Ramaphosa. I do look to Lula in Brazil. You know, I think Mark Carney is a dynamic new leader in Canada. So you know, there's people out there who, you know, really are capable of maybe taking the world with them. They tend to be a bit bogged down with domestic issues as well, and all politics is local in the end. But if they have the space, I think there's, you know, tremendous potential for adding value to international debate and leadership.
Thank you so much. That's a great note to end on. Thank you for giving us some hope, some people to watch, and a huge thank you for sharing your wisdom, your perspectives. I know that everybody in this room is so grateful for having the opportunity to hear you. It really is an honor. So could you please give a big hand to the elders? And we'll transition out and welcome onto the stage our second panel, which will be hosted by Agri Aluso, Executive Director of Resilience Action Network Africa. And I can ask our elders to follow me off stage. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, elders. Could you give a warm round of applause for our next panel as they make their way to the stage? Yeah, just yeah. Yeah. Thank you very much. I think that was a very powerful. Yes. Whichever seat you want. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much, the elders. I think that was a powerful scene-setting conversation. And our next panel really are people who are in the various spaces doing what needs to be done. I think the elders really set the tone, really acknowledging the interconnected challenges and the need for leadership. I think that's the big takeaway from that session. So I am privileged to be joined by distinguished panelists here who are going to reflect on the strategies and tools. And we were reminded by the previous panel that we have more tools than before. Yet we continue to deploy them selectively in ways that are not serving intentions or purposes that they intended to serve. And therefore we want to reflect with these distinguished leaders in various institutions in the world in terms of how can we work differently in ways that we can address the current challenges and also be better prepared to address the future challenges, which are becoming a bit many and overlapping. So without much ado, I want to introduce the panel that really a constellation of distinguished global leaders, starting with Priya Basu, who is the Executive Head of Pandemic Fund. Welcome, Priya. Chris Elias, who is the President of Global Development at the Gates Foundation. Welcome, Dr. Chris. Chikwe Ohazu, sitting next to me, is the Executive Director of WHO Health Emergencies Program. And have also Felicitas Reido, just to wave, a Director of the Innovation and Competitiveness Department at the European Investment Bank. I am also honored to have Jonane Rottingen, Chief Executive Officer at the Wellcome Trust. Also pleased to be joined by Dr. Mariangela Simao, the Secretary for Health and Environmental Surveillance, Ministry of Health, Brazil. And of course, thank you very much. And of course, my name is Agri Aluso. I'm the Executive Director of Resilience Action Network Africa, and I have the honor and privilege to be moderating this session. And without much ado, I want to turn over to Dr. Chikwe sitting next to me. Dr. Chikwe, I think I need to give you flowers. You know, you have been at the forefront, I know, doing the most difficult work that needs to be done. And I think you have really shown, leadership and really created a lasting legacy as a champion of strong national public health institution, something I think continue to inspire your work at the WHO, where you now hold a very critical position. Now, on to my question, Dr. Chikwe. As the head of WHO's emergency program, health emergency program, you're witnessing firsthand what was being described by the elders here, the interconnection, the manifestations of these challenges now manifesting in the health. We have the issues of health, climate, and conflict really creating challenges that we have to deal with every single day. How do you think our collective mindset and our policy making need to shift, so that we can try and prevent, or at the very least, preempt this crisis? What do you think the world needs to do in this regard? Over to you.
Thanks, I agree. Okay, yeah, it's working. Firstly, let me just say that sitting in front and listening to the elders, we have a saying on our continent that we stand on the shoulders of our elders. And I think it really makes sense, literally, in the context of listening to them speak. And just on one point Mary Robinson made on the courage to even raise the bar of expectations. I'm lucky to work with a gentleman leading the organization I work for at the moment, who pushes us every single day to push harder, and no matter how hard the challenges are. In that context, and for your question on the intersection between conflict, climate, and health emergencies, let me think about it this way. Firstly, in illustrating the challenges that we face and how I see them in three ways. Firstly, lots of references have been made to the increasing geopolitical challenges around the world, not only in this country, in many others, as it affects our world. In the increasing ideologically driven policymaking, which we have to think, all of us in this room as scientists and as public health people, on how to manage. And thirdly, just a historical fact that a lot of the investments in the last 30 years in my space, if we pick surveillance, for instance, there was a study Chris would know about that we looked at all the runs, all the resource that's gone into surveillance is actually quite a lot. But they're all in buckets in vertical programs that make it impossible to move to other places even when there are deficits in those places. So if you think about that intersection between conflict, climate, and health, how do we begin to address this? You refer to national public health agencies, and that was definitely one of my early, kind of talking points, and it always made sense. But the more I work in the global space, I see that we don't only need these national agencies. We really need a coalescing group of entities at the global, regional, and national level. Because it's only by working together, one step below the policy making of our health ministers, that we can bring together the technical expertise with the leadership it requires to make these decisions. And there's a lot of doom and gloom, and just listening to Dr. Brundtland, I wished I had 5 minutes to run after her and thank her, and to tell her, what has evolved since she led the organization. Since she led the organization, the fact that 132 countries have done joint external evaluations where they sit with their peers and evaluate their preparedness. I want to tell her about the pandemic fund and how that is driving development in every country. The pandemic hub, the international medical countermeasures platform. There's so many new things that have come together because we have come together, we, the people in this room. And those things are never celebrated enough, but I am privileged to work on them every single day. So I want to leave the room with the last statement that was made, to just keep pushing on each of these, and they are coming together. It might not be obvious every day, but there have been lots of improvements, and I think if we continue pushing with WHO, coalescing our partners, the regional health organizations, Africa CDC, ECDC, and the national public health agencies, driving all of these together, I think we can collectively move towards the expertise that we need to move forward. My last point, we very often ask, we have a lot of ideas of what needs to be done, and there are lots of ideas and they will keep pushing. Ultimately, who will do this? These are the institutions with the leadership at these three levels that will both translate the evidence of climate to work, translate the evidence of health to action, and work in the conflict zones to mitigate the impact of this climate. So the institutions are necessary, not only at the national level, which are the big advocate for, but at the global, regional, and national levels, and then they all need to work together.
Thank you so much, Dr. Chiku. I think that cannot be said better, the importance of having strong institutions globally, but also, very importantly, strong institutions at the national level, because that's where most of these outbreaks start, and that's where they can stop. Thank you so much. So turning over to you, Dr. Jonani, and it's been a privilege connecting with you in various spaces, and we acknowledge your leadership from Act A and to the post-Act A. Remember, working the corridors with you in South Africa. And now you have a very influential role at the Wellcome Trust. And truly, I think you have shown exemplary leadership. So I want to just pose to you this question, Dr. Jonani. At the Wellcome Trust, you have quite clear areas of work, including climate, health, and research. From your vantage point, what are the strategies that we should be financing as government and philanthropies? And how should civil society and other stakeholders prepare for the world that is coming, rather than wait and rely on past structures? And how can we change, how can the changes we need go further and faster?
Well, thank you. And we live in a challenging time, but I think I'd really like to take Chikwe's sort of viewpoint as well, because the glass is half full and not half empty. We need leadership, and it's great to see the leaders who have been on stage. And in a way, it's in some ways strange that leaders that, in average, at least statistically, have fewer years to come, they have the ability to see the furthest away. And it's also the fact that those who tend to have going out of leadership positions, they tend to be bolder than those who are in leadership positions. I think that's the fact also of actually the challenges we currently have, and we are run by sovereign states and democracy. And we need leadership, but we also, I think more than ever, need science. And from the word I come from, show me the evidence is the starting point for any conversation on what kind of decisions should we take. Wellcome is supporting science. We're supporting science also in complex areas where it is more challenging to get the evidence. And one clear example is the interconnectedness between climate and health, where we need to understand scenarios on climate change, but also needs to understand their impact on health outcomes, and also understand that those impacts are happening on the ground. So we need local evidence, not only the global average, but actually understanding how heat waves, air pollution, and so forth impacts individuals. But I would like to sort of shift then more to where we are, because we see seismic shifts in global health currently. And in some way, we see some positive trends, but they can also be seen as negative. And I think the really strong call, maybe in particular from African leaders, for more self-reliance, independence, aid independence, so away from aid dependency, speaking for health sovereignty. And in a way, that echoes also some of the states who are also very much talking about sovereignty and not being influenced and run by international or multilateral organizations. So how can sort of one framing, one entry point to sovereignty with another entry point to sovereignty be seen as a potential platform for reform? Because I think we need to build on this call from African leaders and also other developing countries to be more independent and to have responsibility for their own systems, their own capabilities, And that is the reform we need to see in global health. More leadership in countries would need to set the priorities. At the same time, we both know that many countries, and in particular those with the less resources, they will need support and partners to do so. And I think we will have the risk to forget the collective action that we still need. And Chikwe talked about some of those. How do we still then mount sufficient support for mechanisms that need to handle the cross-border threats like climate change and epidemics or outbreaks? And I think actually the trend towards sovereignty and a focus on bilateral partnerships, transactional approaches to strengthening local capabilities and national capabilities, really great. But I'm a bit afraid that we may, in that reform, which I think is a direction of travel for global health, we need to really remember that, as Gro Harlem Brundtland also very clearly said, without the mechanisms to look at the leadership, the evidence, and the financing we need for the collective problems, we will have big problems coming.
Thank you so much. I think very important points in terms of really what needs to change. And I think the shift from the over-reliance to local capabilities, I think that's where a lot of us who are in the health advocacy or in the advocacy field as citizen-led organizations have a lot of work to do, and with the support of the foundations like yours. So turning over to Dr. Chris Elias, and I just want to also acknowledge your long-standing leadership in shaping global health and development, and really also shaping how philanthropy drives impact and catalyze long, lasting reforms. So to my question, Dr. Chris Elias, given the great shifts that we are witnessing in the global space, particularly in health and development investment, how should leaders be setting priorities? From your perspective at the Gates Foundation, how are you getting things done? How are you doing things differently? What are the big bets? And what is the role of philanthropy in sparking and catalyzing these changes?
Thank you, Agre, and thanks everyone for being here. It was such a rich panel with the elders and my colleagues on this panel already. I'm glad I'm not going last because I'm not sure I have anything to say. So I'm trying to organize my thoughts. First, a word about philanthropy. I think the best philanthropy is always looking for how to be catalytic. Many of you I see attended our goalkeepers event last night where Bill reiterated his pledge that he made back in May to give away substantially all of his wealth, an estimated $200 billion over the next 20 years. That sounds like a lot of money, but it's actually a tiny amount for what we need. Pandemic preparedness, the high-level panel for the G20 estimated that the world needs to invest about $10 billion a year. If we did nothing else, we could do that for the next 20 years. And then who would do it when we closed our shop? And of course, it's not the only thing we do. So as we think about philanthropy, we have to think about where is the catalytic opportunity. And then listening to the panel of elders, the wisdom was, as everyone said, great, but it's also somewhat alarming, their message. And what I heard was that on the one hand, we're in a time of crisis, and at the other hand, we're at a time of scarcity. And that combination of crisis and scarcity is incredibly dangerous because, the Gates Foundation, like Wellcome, tries to ground our perspectives in science. And the science of scarcity suggests that when you're scarce of things, money, time, friends, you focus, you tunnel, and you focus on what's in front of you. And unfortunately, that leads sometimes to bad allocative decisions. It means responding to in an expensive way to crises as opposed to making the longer term investments that in prevention and preparedness that are necessary. And all the studies that the IPPR and the GPMB and others have shown is that, the sooner you can prevent ideally, or identify a crisis, the less it costs to deal with it. And I think we learned that with SARS when Gro was there. We learned that obviously recently with COVID-19. We've learned it with Ebola, many of the efforts that Chikwe has led. So in this time, this dangerous time of both a crisis and scarcity, what do we all need to do? We all need to think about what's the best value for money. And for many countries, and I think this goes to the regional discussion you were referring to, John Arna, they're going to focus on their priorities, which, you know, hopefully those will be driven by careful analysis of where the best value for money is, and that'll often be in strengthening their primary health systems, creating a more resilient health system for responding to crises, making smart investments in their preparedness, prevention and preparedness. But what is unlikely to happen is that as people are focusing on their priorities, they're going to miss what I think Helen was referring to, the importance of investing in global public goods. And I think that's where philanthropy has an important role to play. So the Gates Foundation is continuing. We're not reducing our budgets. We just yesterday, Bill recommitted to our pledge to the Global Fund of $912 million for the next 3 years. We're going to stay steady. But, you know, we need to, I think, prioritize what I think is a unique role for philanthropy. The science, I mean, I think it was Mary who said, you know, science is proceeding at pace. And all the fog of confusing announcements about vaccines and Tylenol and everything, the science is clear, and the science has never been clearer, and the pace of science and innovation has never been faster. So let's not miss the opportunity to harness that science, have a robust R&D agenda, you know, follow through on some of the commitments the world made following the pandemic of, you know, really aligning around a 100-day mission. Let's get the tools to respond to the next pandemic. If we don't already have them, let's get them within 100 days. That's going to take substantial investments in science, in technology, and in innovation. It's also going to require investing in some of the less sexy things like surveillance. You know, Gates Foundation recently made a significant grant to the WHO for the collaborative surveillance efforts that Dr. Chikwe has championed. And we've actually learned a lesson in the last 6 months, which has been really telling to me. You know, when there was an abrupt disruption of the US government foreign assistance earlier this year, hundreds of millions of dollars of support for AIDS, TB, malaria programs, primary health care, community health workers across the African continent were interrupted. The Gates Foundation wasn't in any position to step in and fill that gap. But we did mobilize about $30 million of flexible resources to respond in about a dozen countries where we could put in $2 or $3 million per country. And we talked to the heads of state and the ministers of health and finance and said, what's your priority? We can't fill your gap, but we have some flexible funds, we can help you. And we'll align it to what your priorities are. And what's been interesting to me is that in many of those countries, they have very variable needs and, you know, had variable levels of disruption. But in many of those countries, the request has been for data and analytics that help them understand the crisis and guide them to the best value for money investments as they try to mobilize domestic resources. And so, you know, it's often become instantiated as a presidential delivery unit or a ministerial delivery unit, because what they're looking to us as a catalytic philanthropy is for the data to guide their best decisions. And as they do that, we need to align regionally, globally, against that. And so again, investing in data and analytics is often not seen as a very sexy thing to do. We're happy to do it. We have an above average appetite for data and analytics. So I think, you know, the role of philanthropy in a time of both crisis and scarcity is to really work closely with countries as they weather this storm. And at the other side, to really invest in some of those global public goods that are unlikely to get prioritized by individual countries or even regional bodies at a time of crisis. And so that's how we're trying to see our way through the current world. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I think that cannot be put better. And your last point about, you know, investing in data, I was having a conversation last week with one of our national statistical agency who are now impacted by the rollback from USAID, who cannot now do the DHS. And he was saying, like, we're going to be flying blind and we don't know when we're going to hit the wall. So I agree with him on that. And I think the importance of really recognizing the gaps are too huge to be filled. So we need to be thoughtful about how we catalyze action for sustainable solutions. Thank you so much for your thoughts. So turning to you, Felicitas Reido, it's a privilege to have you join us today. And I think you bring in a unique perspective. You would realize most of the colleagues who have spoken here from health, including yourself, but you sit in a different space. You work in a bank, but you have a, like a brilliant health background, and I appreciate it. That's the kind of scenario we all hope for, that we have people who understand health sitting in finance decision-making spaces. So I want to turn over to you, and in your role as the Director of Innovation and Competitiveness Department at the AE Bank, the European Investment Bank. Given the current context, how must multilateral banks, such as the European Investment Bank, adapt strategies to build resilience to interconnected threats, including climate, pandemic preparedness, health, biosecurity, defense, and many others? So could you just reflect on those with us?
Yes, thank you very much for giving me the opportunity, and also to allow me to demonstrate why it makes sense that a bank like the EIB can also be part of finding solutions to all the challenges that we address. Unfortunately, I don't have one solution, one easy thing that addresses these challenges. I think first of all, we need to acknowledge that all these challenges are interlinked. So we cannot look at health, climate, biosecurity in isolation. We need to make sure that we come up with something that addresses a systemic approach. And here I want to highlight again that from EIB perspective, we are willing and we are looking into innovative solutions that address both public, private sector with different types of financial instruments, and in ideal sense to leverage the grant funding that is available with long-term loans that make investments into these crucial sectors doable and put an incentive. What I also would like to add to the conversation is the fact of impact. I think we have spoken a lot about the necessity, resilience, but a way to look at it is as well with, if we invest $1 into this activity, what is the return on investment to society? And this is something that we as EIB very strongly look into. The reason why I'm here is I'm leading the technical department. So EIB is looking for every time we provide a loan into the economic and financial viability of the underlying investments that we do support. And here, this is a means for us to ensure. Coming back to the topic of today, from EIB, we have really stepped up our activities in the COVID pandemic. We have also changed the way what we consider as eligible investments as the result of the pandemic. We really pay attention to support resilient health systems, and that starts from infrastructure. The infrastructure we support not only needs to be embedded into long-term health strategies of the respective countries, but also needs to be resilient in terms of climate. So if you're in a flooding area, this is something we are looking into. Now with the increased heat, we need to make sure that sufficient air conditioning, for example, is in place. But equally, we need to make sure, and I think this is an additional value add that a bank such as ours can bring, is the share of best practices. So we see things not only in Europe, but globally, and things that may work in a specific setting are also relevant for different settings. And to connect the dots, this is something that is of importance. Having said this, I fully support and strongly support the necessity of science. It is shocking that in the world of today, we still are faced with all these anti-vaccine campaigns, or I think you yourself, no, I don't want this shot because then Bill is putting a chip into me. Or I mean, these crazy ideas that are out there and that require extra unnecessary effort to go against. Nevertheless, we need to also be mindful that these concerns do exist, and it's also not correct to just ignore them or laugh about them, but we need to bring the people on board to create sustainable solutions. So let me conclude by pointing out to you, we are very keen to invest in our investments. We really look for sustainable solutions. We are the climate bank, so whatever we do needs to ensure that it doesn't have a negative impact and is in line with the agreement that was also signed in Paris. And we are not only climate and health bank, but we are also very much focused on resilience, so to create systems that allow us to be sustainable going forward. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. I think that is very future-facing kind of a bank, and I love the centering of resilience in all you do, and distinguishing yourself as the climate bank. I think that's something that a lot of us have things to learn from. So my privilege to turn to you, Secretary Dr. Mariangela Simao. Mariangela Simao, as I had mentioned in the introduction, is the Secretary of Health and Environmental Surveillance at Brazil's Ministry of Health. We celebrate and acknowledge your leadership, Madam Secretary, and particularly in shaping Brazil's political commitment in addressing interlinked challenges of health and environmental agendas, and particularly at this point when we're heading to COP30 in Belém. So over to my question, Dr. Simao. You have been working very hard, really trying to bring climate and health together. How can we build financing structure that supports actions, policies, and innovation that deliver for health, for people, for planet, for oceans alike, and many others beyond those? What kind of strategies do we need, and what kind of financing do we need to tackle future threats? And how are you thinking about this in the context of the Brazilian, leadership as a country hosting COP?
Thank you, I agree. First of all, I must say I'm very glad I'm not on the panel of the elders. I'm probably the eldest person here.
I think that's very important that you're here.
With these two panels, we do have around 500 years of experience in public health. So we are doing good, right? But I can see also there's a lot of younger people in the panel too, and also in the audience. So it's good to be here. Thank you for inviting me. Now, before I enter onto the question, I have to make some political comments, because we are living now a very maybe peculiar situation. It's a weird situation, actually, right? Because we do have, what do we have right now in the current context? We have attacks on multilateralism. We are seeing this every day, right? We have attack on specific countries, and my country is being attacked. Right? Brazil is being attacked now on the sovereignty. When another government, U.S. government, is saying to Brazil that you shouldn't put in jail the next president who tried to do a coup d'etat. So it's so. But there's an attack on health. And what you're saying about denialism, it's true. Because when denialism becomes a public policy, it affects the world. It doesn't only affect Brazil or this country or that country. It affects the world, because what we are seeing now, and I'm now in the Ministry of Health, but I was 12 years in the multilateral system as well, and before that, I always worked in Brazil. But what we're seeing now, like the attack on vaccines, and what we see in the Americas is a surge of measles. Come on, measles, It's a vaccine that we've known for more than 60 years, and now Brazil is trying, and Brazil and the neighbors, we are all trying to stave off, boost up our vaccine coverage, but it doesn't help when the U.S. maybe the CDC says you don't need to vaccinate newborns against hepatitis B, unless the mother is positive. But we know that mothers are not positive. They are not tested many times, right? Anyway, the end of this political part is to say that Minister Padilha, who's the Minister of Health of Brazil, was unable to come to this General Assembly because he got a very restricted visa. He could move 5 blocks around the UN, so, okay, so he's not coming. So I'm heading the health delegation. But on the climate, but that's what happens when you have some things that you can't explain, right? But on what happens on the climate and health, we do have WHO's plan, which was approved last year at the World Health Assembly, which is extremely welcome. Now, and what happened specifically in Belém, not Belém, Belém. Belém, we do have the attached, the WHO people working with us. We have the coalition of Baku, which is Azerbaijan, Brazil, Egypt, Emirates, and UK. And we do have support from at least to the Gates Foundation and from the Wellcome Trust and also from the Rockefeller on setting up the agenda, because what we really want to, what I always say, maybe I'm too old in the health system now, but the discussion cannot start with financing, because to go to financing, you need to have a solid plan. And I don't mean a complicated plan with all these indicators, because then it's complicated to approve, even for countries to adopt commitments that are hardcore, right? But what we are planning for Belém is the Belém Plan of Action on Health. And I'm very happy also to notice that we are bringing together the agendas, the climate change, let's say climate emergency, and the health consequences and how the health sector has to react to that, right? So what we are bringing to Belém, and this has been several months of hard work with countries and so, is the Belém Health Action Plan, right? And this brings 3 axes, and it goes with what Chris Elias was saying, like countries want data analytics. One of the line of actions is on surveillance and monitoring. You need data to do that. That's the first line of action. So what we need, I think, I think there is a growing interest in the past COPs, the climate COP, right? Because there are the COPs. COP 30 and COP 31 and 32, we want them to have a health day, dedicated day. We are going to have one in Belém. We had one in Baku, but it wasn't named as a health day. Now it is a health day, and we want next year and the year after that the Belém Plan of Action, Health Plan of Action is discussed. And we bring experience that country managed to do. Because there's a lot on the climate agenda that it's kind of paralyzing because it's so complex. And every COP you discuss and doesn't move forward. Health can help us move forward. And to finalize, yesterday I said something, and it resonated with people. Most people here know Pink Floyd, right? Yeah. No, I know, I keep track because I have 2 sons who are in mid-30s, and I ask them. If they know, then most people know, still know. No, but there's a song by Pink Floyd. I've been reminiscent lately, and Hey You, and it says at the end, don't tell me there's no hope at all. Together we stand, divided we fall. This is about not falling down and not being divided. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think that's a powerful reflection there, and I think really captures the theme of our meeting today. How do we remain standing, because there's so many things pushing us and we can't afford to fall. So Priya, turning over to you, and it's a pleasure to have you join this panel today. We recognize your leadership as the pioneer head of Pandemic Fund. You have played a key role in shaping the direction and really one of the critical, very, very consequential post-pandemic, post-COVID, not pandemic, pandemics are not gone, post-COVID institutions. So just want to invite you to reflect with us on the core mandate of Pandemic Fund, which I know entail 3 core areas of focus, surveillance, laboratory systems, and workforce, all of which are very critical for really driving the resilient health system that we've all been talking about here today. Given the current and future threats and the gap between the needs and commitments, how is the fund adapting? And how should leaders be prioritizing investment? And what gaps must be filled? Over to you.
Thank you so much, and it's a pleasure to be here. First of all, I want to thank the elders and the Pandemic Action Network and the Resilience Action Network and all the organizers of today's meeting for really keeping the focus on the pandemic agenda, because I think in an era of multipolarity, it's easy for pandemic prevention, preparedness, and response to slip down the list of priorities. And we know what happened in the past when the world fell into cycles of neglect following panic. Look what happened, when we faced COVID. We were utterly unprepared, and that's because the world hadn't invested in core pandemic prevention, preparedness, and response capacities, despite the fact that we'd all lived through SARS and MERS and avian influenza and Zika and Ebola, and then came COVID. So thank you for helping to keep the focus on this very important agenda, which, as many before me have highlighted, is interconnected with climate and with the environment and so on. But pandemic PPR in itself is an important area for us to focus on. I want to emphasize that investing in pandemic prevention, preparedness, and response must not be seen as an expense. It really is an investment in the future. And again, I think studies have shown that the cost of getting all low and middle income countries prepared for the next pandemic are a tiny fraction of the cost of not being prepared. Look what happened with COVID. And of course, it needs sustained political commitment, and it needs long-term thinking, as we heard from the elders. So turning now to your question about how the Pandemic Fund is adapting to the current context. I just want to emphasize firstly that in this current global context, as we've heard from speakers before me, I think what we're seeing is a new era, and we're seeing a decisive shift towards a much more self-reliant world, a world where country ownership and country-driven approaches are central, as captured in the Lusaka Agenda, and now embraced by so many countries and partners. And these are the core principles, in fact, on which the Pandemic Fund is built. We are country-led. We focus on collaborative action, on bringing partners together, recognizing that no one entity can achieve what we want to achieve on our own. We're catalytic. Every dollar of grants that we award draw in resources from international partners as well as from the countries themselves, making sure that everyone has a skin in the game. And so you could say that we were, in fact, ahead of our times when we were established, and we had anticipated, or our founders had anticipated, the direction of the global conversation. So it's a great place to be in. We've already delivered strong results in less than 3 years. Our third anniversary will, in fact, be celebrated in November. And in these 3 years, we've shown that we can deliver. We already have a portfolio of $7 billion, which comprises the grants that we've awarded, but also the money that we've drawn in, the catalytic work that we've done. So $7 billion of pandemic PPR investments across 75 countries in 6 regions, focusing on some of the unsexy topics, Chris, that you spoke about: surveillance, laboratory strengthening, workforce, frontline workforce, and testing and diagnostics, and all of this not only to help today, to help today's challenges, but very much focusing on surge capacity that can be ramped up in times of crisis. And we've already raised $3 billion, and we need more. The demand is huge. Every time we issue a call for proposals, we get 5, 6, 7 times as much in demand, particularly from countries in Africa. But now turning to the last point about adaptability. So we're in a good place. We have a good structure, but of course, there are lessons that we've learned from the past 3 years, and there are There are always opportunities to improve. The good news is we're young enough to be flexible, agile. It's always easier to adapt when you're a new institution instead of sort of, a dinosaur type of institution. So one of the things that we want to do is we want to be able to catalyze more resources. We've demonstrated the part of our catalytic model, but there's more we can do. So we're looking at what will it take to be able to draw in even more resources from multilateral development banks as co-financing. They've already come in a big way, but there's more. There's more they can do, and so, we're looking at how we can sort of enter into pre-agreed sort of structured agreements with MDBs on co-financing. So we're working on that, starting in fact with good work good progress that we've made with the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, and of course the World Bank has been a large provider of co-financing. We've also seen that the private sector has come into our projects, so we're now working more systematically and more intentionally with the private sector on bringing them in upstream. We recently launched an external advisory council of private sector and other leaders who can sort of advise us on shaping what we do. And thirdly, as I said, our model is already country-driven, country-owned, but we're looking at ways to be able to align our resources even better with the plans and the budgets of governments. Also the plans and budgets of MDBs and of global health initiatives like the Global Fund and so on, they are part of our initial partner group, but we need to do more to bring them in. So these are some of the areas that we're adapting. So thank you.
Thank you so much. Can we give them a warm round of applause? Thank you so much. And I think as you're speaking, I'm reminded of so many lots of wisdom that came from the elders, but previously of how in this world of today we cannot afford to think as silos and individuals or single entities. We really have to think as the world, federate locally, but act locally. Where the action is really required is at the local level. And how do we create an ecosystem that capacitates the different nations of the world to act and do what they need to do? And I think Pandemic Fund does that, working with different regions, working with different countries, and all of the work that we're doing, catalyzing action to really create the necessary transformation for countries and institutions to have the capability to do what they need to do. So another warm round of applause to the panel. So I know we are nearly out of time, but I think we have room for 2 questions from the audience. So we have mic runners. I see one hand at the front. Any other hand? Okay, yes, Dr. Berry. Go ahead.
Hi, my name is Megan Stone. I'm from the Long COVID campaign and the Long COVID Coalition. I served in the past and was like president of the Malala Fund before I was disabled by COVID and long COVID in 2022. And I also just want to shout out Eloise and Pandemic Action Network for welcoming disabled people and making this an accessible event. Thank you. Thank you so much. I just wanted to ask about the inclusion of impacted communities in the ongoing pandemic negotiations. There's about 400 million people like me that are impacted by long COVID globally, and we really need to see research for our first therapeutics tests and just paying for care. But it's sometimes difficult for us as disabled people to hear the discussion of the future while ignoring the present need. I know that's no one's intention, so I wanted to ask, how can we invite folks like myself and our patient community to the table? And not just in tokenism, to be successful together. I'm part of a patient group where we've successfully defended $1.8 billion from cuts by the current administration, including reversing $500 million in DOGE cuts this year. So no one's gonna work harder than the people who are impacted. We wanna work together. So I just welcome your advice about how we can be part of this discussion and sit at the table together.
Thank you very much to the panel and preceding one. It's been a really interesting start to the day. The elders in their panels suggested that there were troublemakers in the room, so I felt it was important that I speak up as a troublemaker. So my name is Ebera Kerrick. I'm a public health physician and an honorary troublemaker. So the question I want to ask, actually, I want to put it specifically to you, Chris, and to John Anne. You mentioned public goods, and it's a really important recognition that most investment in health is around public health. Yes, we have been talking about health being an actual income generator and part of economic growth for countries. Recognize that, but the early investment in particular is a public good. Now, and at risk of being restricted to 5 blocks around the UN, our host country just published their global health, America First global health strategy. And it's very clear there that they, who have up till now been the biggest investor in those public goods that we rely on, are moving to a very different approach, a very transactional. How can organizations like yours and the rest of us, how do we respond to this? How can we actually ensure that the investment and the access to those public goods is maintained and, if anything, accelerated? Because we need them now more than ever. Thank you.
All right, so I will invite the panelists to respond. I know there were questions that were specifically addressed to Dr. Chris and Dr. John, but the first one about inclusion.
So thank you very much. It was a very important question, and we need more voices like yours. Thanks for coming today. Sitting in that room, which I've done for the past 3 years with our colleagues negotiating the pandemic agreement, member states, really difficult process to get it to where it is now. And now we're going through with the Intergovernmental Working Group on the PABS Annex, on the Partisan Access and Benefit Sharing System. Very difficult topics to discuss, to agree. But I'm often motivated by, my career evolved in the beginning of the AIDS pandemic. And I got to know intimately along my career some colleagues that are working in something that grew to become the Treatment Action Campaign in South Africa. And the first time I spoke to the leaders, they told me that the first thing they had to do to become great advocates is to understand the disease that they were advocating about. And so it is in not only advocating, but with a deep understanding of the implications of the pandemic we've just gone through and the potential implications of those in the future. And having the courage like you have to raise your voices in places like this and others will really keep us on the table, because it is hard sometimes sitting in those rooms for hours debating the work we're doing, but we're on it, and thank you very much for raising your voice. And maybe just one comment on Abera's question. I think over this week, next week, we'll hear all the fancy words around sovereignty, country ownership, and you will not find a single person that will dispute any of that, because it sounds good as the right thing to do. But ultimately, we've got to build those institutions. So I see, you refer to national public health agencies, I don't see them as static organizations. I really see them as a good equivalent as a vibrant, big medical teaching hospital, where you have medical lab technicians, nurses, radiologists, all at different stages of their career, all learning and growing with each other, but still working together in a incredibly complex system to deliver healthcare. So we need to think about public health like that. And if you can have these complex things together growing all the time, that's where the sovereignty lies in public health. You cannot just wish for sovereignty. You have to build those institutions. So this is what I challenge the countries I come from, in my part of the world. Yes, we've got the political commitment to sovereignty growing, but we now have to focus on what we have to do ourselves in our countries to build the science, the data, the capacity, the institutions, the people, to do what we want to do, what we say we want to do.
Yeah, maybe comment on the public good questions, because in a way health as a sector is a public good sector, we know, and at the national level or whatever jurisdictions you've organized accordingly to protect and promote and improve health is a public good, and that can be structured in universal health coverage systems, either tax-based or through health insurance. And I think that is a responsibility for countries and stewardships to do that. That's the health sovereignty. I believe, of course, we are a foundation supporting science, so we are in particular focusing on the global public goods. So the the needs that all countries would tend to underinvest in because they focus on their own specific needs. And of course, highlighting research and also translating research into evidence, to decisions and to action. We need stronger institutions like the World Health Organization on the normative side. On the research side, we need a multitude of actors and institutions, private sector, public institutions, and of course academic free institutions. I am concerned about the tendency now to reduce investments in infectious disease related research. We see that across the world. We can go more broadly to what we can call global health relevant research or poverty related health challenges. Climate and health is one example. And I think global foundations like Gates and Chris already talked about this, we can play a catalytic role, but we can never play a sustained role in investing in this. So I think what we need to be much more clever at is how do we incentivize and partner with governments to do those necessary steps to also invest in global public goods, not only national public goods.
Maybe I'll just compliment, I know we're out of time. I think there's a few things we need to do. First is we need to continue to advocate and remind groups like the US government of their incredible track record in investing in global public goods, harnessing the science of and the institutions of the United States to produce, you know, Operation Warp Speed, $10 billion helped us get, it wasn't 100 days, but it was less than a year for the first mRNA vaccines. Yeah, and there's a long history of the U.S. actually investing substantially in U.S. public goods, and we need to remind people of that and how that has actually served the soft power interests of the United States. Secondly, we need the corporate sector to see the products that they bring out of their innovation pipelines not as private goods, but as public goods. You know, they took a reputational hit during the COVID pandemic and during many other pandemics, starting with the AIDS pandemic, for coming slowly to the realization that they needed to make the products of innovation available in an affordable way. And one of the tools we have, I think, in trying to ensure that is the ongoing discussions that the panel referred to, the first panel, on the pathogen access and benefit sharing. Now that we have a pandemic agreement that was agreed by the member states of the WHO, we need to instantiate the commitment for benefit sharing in advance of the next pandemic. If we don't do all those things, I think what you'll see is that catalytic philanthropies will probably need to focus more and more of their resources on public goods. We'd rather not be the only ones, and if we're the only ones, we won't be sufficient. And so, you know, I think, you know, there is an opportunity. There's a particular role, as I said in my first comments, for philanthropy in investing in global public goods, but we shouldn't do it alone. And historically, we haven't done it alone, and that's been a benefit to those who have been co-investing with us, including the high-income countries, and including companies, even though it often requires product-by-product specific negotiations, which are lengthy and transactional, when we could actually have a broader paradigm for how we insist on benefit sharing in advance of the next pandemic. Thank you for being a troublemaker.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. And I think that has been a marvelous panel. Can we give them a warm round of appreciation? And as I invite Lois to come and say a word of thanks. Thank you so much.
I'm just going to say a few very quick thank yous. Amazing speakers today, wonderful audience. Thank you to all the partners, independent panel, the elders, RANA, PAN, Africa-Europe Foundation, and to all of you for the work you do in these difficult contexts. Special shout out to Scandinavia House, the AV people, to Courtney from my team who's held all the threads together, Andrea, Christine, Henry, etc. It takes a village. This is a difficult time. Everybody's suffering in different ways. We think the answer is networked advocacy, to work together, not to compete, but to raise each other up and to shine a light on the good work each other are doing. It's hard to do when we're all, like, there's a scarcity issue, but let's club together, let's work across the silos, and let's keep fighting to win, and let's raise the ambition like Mary Robinson challenged us to earlier. Thank you so much for everything you do.